This is not my story, but the story of someone who is very close to me. Todd previously worked as a roofer, and one morning his life took a drastic turn. High up on the roof, he lost his footing, plummeting to the ground. Unfortunately, this event caused him to become a paraplegic. Grappling with this abrupt change, his mental health spiraled and led Todd to abuse drugs and alcohol to cope. During this period, Todd had a long-term best friend named Chad. Todd and Chad had known each other for about over 20 years prior to the incident. No one knew what was coming, nor did they expect it to happen so viciously. On the late evening of October 24, 2020, Todd invited his girlfriend's cousin Justin over to hang out. Justin agreed and stopped by the local party store to pick up some soda for Todd. Just around 1 a.m. October 25th, Justin arrives to accompany Todd, his cousin Jay, and Chad. Justin mentioned that everyone was having a good time, that no one got into any arguments, and in fact he barely interacted or saw Chad the entire night. He stated the only time he did see Chad is when he occasionally went to relieve himself in the bathroom. The early morning crept up on everyone, and Jay mentions she has to wake up early for work and insists she's going to lay down. Justin agrees, and at 4 a.m. he says his farewells to everyone and heads out. 7 a.m. rolls around, and Jay reluctantly wakes up to get ready for work and leaves the home before 7:30 a.m. It's between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. when Chad is determined to murder his own best friend. After acquiring a crowbar and a metal pipe, he takes the metal pipe and swings it against the side of Todd's head. Todd falls forward onto the ground as Chad continues to swing the pipe again and again. Blood begins to pool around, splashing against the walls and furniture. He proceeds to equip the crowbar, slashing at Todd so hard he created sores on his own hands. Later found in the medical examination, it showed Todd had defensive wounds all over his arms. He tried his hardest to get away from Chad, even resulting in clawing marks found engraved on the floor where he tried to crawl away. As Todd lay motionless on the ground, Chad had to make sure Todd wouldn't survive. That's when he grabbed a plastic bag and tied it around Todd's head, suffocating him to make sure the job was finished. Chad stood over Todd covered in his own best friend's blood, and this didn't deter him. He knew he had to get rid of the evidence, and the panic set in. For some unknown reason, Chad thought undressing Todd would be a brilliant idea. He stripped Todd down to nothing, leaving his mutilated corpse exposed. He rushed into the laundry room, tossing the clothes into the dryer, leaving the laundry room once more, quickly removing any fire alarms that were in sight. He pushed one under a couch, another under a pile of clothes, and used a rubber mallet to smash some. With all of the fire alarms destroyed or misplaced, he quickly made his way into the bathroom. He removed Todd's shower chair, stripped himself clean, and began rinsing himself. After cleaning himself as much as he could, he searched for the nearest clean clothing. Todd was no small man. He was a man who wore about 5 extra large, and Chad wore a medium. He collected his bloodied clothes and tossed them into the dryer. This is where he made the decision to set the house ablaze, using the bloodied clothes and dryer. Chad made one costly mistake and closed the laundry room door. Consequently, this allowed the contained fire to be smothered. Despite being contained, the smoke densely filled the home. Just when he thought he had taken care of all the fire alarms in the home, he could still hear some blaring, so once again, Chad took the mallet and smashed any remaining fire alarms. He dropped the mallet in the kitchen right next to a knife that he decided against when he plotted the murder. Time was ticking against a suffocating thick black smoke. He collected the murder weapons, discarding them into a somewhat overgrown vegetation near the wheelchair ramp and between the house. Luckily, a neighbor who usually was a nuisance took notice of the situation going on next door, along with another neighbor who lived across the street. Chad came frantically running out of the house, reaching the sidewalks before pacing back and forth. The neighbor who lived across was actually a city inspector and came rushing to aid Chad. He testified that he found it weird that there was silence among the chaos. There was no sound of fire alarms going off. He also mentioned to the jury that when he tried to help, he couldn't see at all into the home due to the smoke, but Chad entered and exited the house multiple times, and one time even came out with the rubber mallet. As emergency services arrived only minutes after the call, Chad was seen frantically telling the fire department that his friend was inside. He then proceeds to grab the house hose and sprays the side of the house in an attempt to put out the fire. However, based on the layout, Chad was nowhere near the fire. In fact, the fire was on the opposite side to where Chad was spraying. The fire department questioned Chad if he knew if Todd had escaped. Chad responded, "I don't know. My friend is there," and continued to delay rescue. Firemen slammed against the door that they presumed was locked, but in actuality, they were slamming into the lifeless corpse of Todd. Only when they managed to breach the door, they began blindly trailing into the home. They basically tripped over Todd's lifeless body. This set a rescue in motion in belief that Todd was simply unconscious. It was only when they brought him out to the grass did they see the extent of Todd's injuries. During the intense moments, police quickly detained Chad under suspicion of murder and arson. They photographed his wounded hands, and the medical examiner confirmed matches with wounds from a sliding iron bar. There was also mention that Chad admitted blindly to police that he believed shadow people were walking up and down the road and coming to kill his friend. The police didn't buy it. It was later discovered that Todd and Chad both had traces of methamphetamine and cocaine in their systems. However, Jay and Justin both testified that neither of them had seen Todd using the night prior. Open and shut case. Well, things just get more complicated and infuriating. The victim's family wasn't unable to access the home for almost 2 months, which is understandable. Regardless of whether it was a genuine mistake or poor forensic investigation work, considering it took Todd's own father, who was gardening the overgrown vegetation, and my best friend's aunt, who brought a metal detector. They discovered the weapons 2 years after Todd's death. During the first few months, the victim's family was terrorized by the media, forcing them to flee their homes in order to grieve properly. And for you who don't know what happens when someone you love is viciously murdered in their own home, the family is left to deal with the cleanup. At the time, they didn't know such companies existed until after, and unfortunately, my best friend was someone who was given the responsibility of cleaning out the home. She was mentally exhausted at this point. After trying her hardest to move the couch, she cried out, "Please, just move!" And that's when the voice behind her answered back, a man from New Jersey who helped her just at the right time. Amongst the chaos, COVID was running rampant, delaying a lot of the court dates, but also Chad had a hand in it too. His team constantly requested mental evaluations, but each time Chad was given the opportunity to take the test, he would refuse to speak, forcing them to throw it out. One test turned into 2, and 2 turned into 3. After 3 years, the judge finally denied his request for a private test. Eventually, a trial date was set. My best friend almost had to go through the entire trial alone. Her grandmother couldn't bear to see the gruesome scene, and her grandfather and aunt were both called as witnesses, so I sat with her in that courtroom supporting her as much as I could. He showed no remorse in his actions, only to briefly glance back at my best friend, but met with my face of disgust each time. The evidence was so gruesome. One juror asked to be removed from the stand because she simply couldn't mentally endure it anymore. Each time, the defense team would bring up Todd's drug abuse, fueling more anger, assuming that since he was a drug user, anyone could have done it. But yet, the most disgusting thing you would never want to hear out of a public defender's mouth is, "This case is so easy, my dog could win it," when the victim's family was ears length away. We also found out that Chad was previously kicked out from his home because his wife was terrified that Chad was acting too violently to be around her and the kids. That's when Todd called his family, announcing that he would be letting Chad stay with him for a little. In his words, "I don't think he'll do that." But he would, and he did. In the end, Chad pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and second-degree arson. And still to this day, Chad refuses to accept accountability for what he did to a man who couldn't defend himself properly, nor why he did exactly what he did either. Trigger warning. This story contains animal harm. If you do not want to hear this story, skip to Story 3, which starts at 22 minutes and 33 seconds. 2 weeks ago, I met a guy on Tinder. In his profile photo, he had brown hair that was so dark it almost looked black, styled in a sort of half-up, half-down style. His neck was tattooed with a spider web behind his ear, with a web trailing down to showcase a realistic spider biting his neck. He had other tattoos, but they all seemed to be abstract compared to this one, seemingly just done any old way. He wore red contacts, but it almost looked like he had red eyes with a hint of brown that resembled honey in the sunlight. As his pink lips held a lollipop stick in his mouth, he was taking a selfie in the mirror of a public bathroom. I was about to swipe right, but decided to check his bio to be sure he didn't list anything that could be considered a red flag. He was my age, 23. His bio simply stated, "I hope you like vampires, because I'm a neckbiter who doesn't mind the taste of blood." While all my friends found it cringy when I told them about it, I found it arousing. I have a thing for vampires, if you couldn't already guess. So, this was a win for me. We got to messaging and he expressed interest in hooking up. After some diligent planning, we agreed to start off going out to get to know each other. We wanted to take things slow, understanding boundaries and personalities before we began doing anything. Our first meetup was at the local Arby's, where we talked over sandwiches and curly fries. We had an incredible time. We shared many of the same kinks, interests, and boundaries. It was as if the sex gods had sent this gorgeous man in my direction for a reason. The night after that, I had began experiencing difficulties sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, it was as though something had triggered my beagle, Riley. He would start panicking, barking and growling at my window. Every time I would go check, there would be nothing in sight. I figured perhaps the shadow of a nearby tree was upsetting him, so I put him in his crate for the night. I could hear his muffled barking downstairs for a few minutes, but soon it stopped. In the morning, I discovered something on my window when I went to open the blinds. There was a handprint, as if someone was attempting to break in. However, they seemed to be bloody. The blood seemed as though it was dripping from the middle and index finger, then dried there. I rushed outside in my pajamas in the freezing cold to see if perhaps something had just rusted. But when I looked, the handprint was no longer there. In disbelief, I went back inside, and there wasn't anything. I chalked it up to nothing, assuming my half-asleep body was still adjusting to the morning light. I just went about my life until Victor and I had met up again. Something odd seemed to happen when we were talking, though. He asked me how the advertisement I was working on had come out. I work at a small bank as the graphic design department. I create all-out advertisements, signs for our 4 locations, and promotional photos for social media. I had been working on an advertisement over the last week, but I had never told him that. At least, I don't recall telling him about it. Regardless, I answered the question no matter how odd it seemed to be. Again, the night after our meet-up, strange things happened. When I sent Riley to go potty that night, he wouldn't come in when I was calling him, which is very unlike him. He's very well trained and somewhat clingy at bedtime, so I walked into the yard to find him staring at the fence. This fence separates my yard with my next-door neighbor's yard. Riley was frozen in place, staring at a figure. This figure had on a hood, and I couldn't see his face because of the darkness. My neighbor's back porch light went out the other night, and they had yet to fix it, whereas mine doesn't really go far enough to see past this fence. The only thing I did see was 2 hands, their fingernails red like they were stained with blood. I screamed bloody murder, grabbing Riley and slamming the back door on the way back in. I locked all my doors and windows. After calling both police and my neighbors about the situation, everyone was getting my story. The police informed me that they could not do anything as I didn't see much, and neither of us have cameras to prove anyone was there. They told me it was probably a childish prank from another neighbor's kid. I felt so crazy in that moment, thinking perhaps I've started hallucinating, or that my eyes played tricks on me. That was, until the neighbor's wife let out her own scream of bloody murder that mixed with gut-wrenching sobs. We rushed over to their backyard, where the neighbor was hugging her now dead cat. I never knew they had a cat, but that's because he never had been let outside. The cat was covered in blood, said to be stabbed 7 times. I didn't sleep that night. I spent it sobbing, hugging Riley. It was clear the person had bad intentions, and I just narrowly escaped him while also saving my baby. I told no one in my life about this, because I do not want them thinking that I am crazy. I know there is proof that last night was real. I'm still questioning if maybe I was seeing things and it was some sort of spiritual sign to save my dog, even if I could not save the neighbor's cat. Victor was like a rock to me, giving something to look forward to as the traumatic visuals of that figure haunted my everyday movements. We set up a date to hook up, wanting to try something with blood and needles. I was excited as I have never had anything of this. I always loved exploring new kinks and fetishes. At work, it was clear I wasn't well as my boss sent me home early. On my way home, I stopped by a gas station to fill up and get some snacks. While I was pumping gas into my car, I heard my phone buzz in my purse. I fished it out of there quickly, seeing a weird text from my neighbor. She told me there was a weird man trying to break into my house, but when the police came, there was no sign of him. However, a very small portion of my lawn had been burnt by a cigarette left by the driveway. Now I was freaked out. Why is this happening to me? Who is targeting me? Does this mean everything from before was true and I'm the one this man is after? When I asked for a description, it was the same hooded figure from before, but when the neighbor asked to know who he was, he smiled at her with a blistered face and pink teeth. She screamed, which alerted another neighbor to call the police. I now could not stay at my home, so with a friend, we headed to my house to gather my essentials, and I stayed with her for a couple days. I brought Riley along. Everything had seemed all right. Nothing else had happened. However, the day I was meant to return home, a car followed me to work, driving away when I pulled into the parking lot. At first, I didn't question it as my friend has an apartment, and assumed he was part of the complex, taking a similar route to work. Looking back, it had to be that guy. When I got back home, my living room was wrecked. Nothing was stolen, no signs of a break-in, just trashed. Now, I was utterly terrified to stay in this house, as someone clearly had something out for me. I was not going to take the risk of sleeping here and getting murdered in my sleep. I told Victor about everything, and he offered to let me have his spare room. I protested, insisting I can get a motel. He refused, promising he had a gun if he needed to defend me from anyone. I reluctantly agreed, but his house was very welcoming. The decor was a mix of Gothic but modern, yet it had all seemed homey. Riley seemed a little uneasy, however. I assumed it was the stress of the stalker and having to constantly move. We hooked up the next night. It was amazing. He pleased me in a way I had not ever dreamed of, soon becoming addicted to him. We did it a couple more times afterwards. Every time we did, he wore me out, and I would need a nap or to rest from the night. So after some aftercare, Victor tucked me in and said he would wake me up in the morning when breakfast was prepared. At 3 a.m. I heard a scream, a dog's scream. My stomach dropped as I scrambled out of bed to rush downstairs, thinking Riley fell off something or got hurt somehow. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, there was a man. He had patches of hair on his head, red fingernails, blisters all over. He was leaning over Riley. I yelled for Victor, hoping he was in the bathroom. Only the man turned to look at me and I screamed. The man was Victor, the same blistered man at my house, the same red fingernails from my neighbor's yard, and those pink teeth. He looked like he wasn't ready for me to see him. Riley was on this carpet, bleeding. He had been drinking his blood, the knife still in his pocket. He reached for it when I ran back upstairs and barricaded myself in his bedroom, the only room with a lock. The lock was locked with furniture in front of the door for good measure. I noticed a blood stain on his carpet under a chair in this room. This wasn't my first time. Yes, he had a vial of my blood from our session, but I thought we had used it. I found 4 more in the closet when I emptied it. I knew I was in danger, especially as he pounded on the door, growling out my name. He soon resorted to stabbing the door, hoping I was behind it. I rushed to get dressed and grab my stuff as I heard him begging to be let in, saying he needs my blood to cure him. He needed my nutrients. He promised he would be good to me if I just supplied him with his medicine. I didn't listen, especially as he punched a hole through the door. I was out the window by the time he was peeking through the door, screaming my name. I had thrown my stuff before me, which somewhat cushioned my fall from the room. My ankle is fucked from the fall, but it didn't matter. I ran to my car and threw my stuff in the back as I saw the knife get stabbed through the front door. He ran after my car as I sped away. In the ER, I explained everything to the nurses and the police. I've been tested for STDs and STIs. I haven't gotten the results back yet. I gave the police my statement, in which they informed me Victor's house was abandoned. No one had lived there in 5 years, and his Tinder was gone too. I only had a photo of his neck and chest, nothing of his face. I don't think they're ever going to find him, if he even exists. I do not feel safe. I've quit my job, moved, dyed my hair. I've even gotten filler hoping it changed my appearance some. I'm a wreck without Riley, but the image of that man drinking his blood haunts me from ever wanting another beagle again. I'm in a motel right now, as I hop between them hoping I'll never be discovered. I'm running out of savings, which terrifies me. My mom has offered up my old room if I ever need to move back home and has suggested counseling. I cannot leave the motels. I just can't. I don't know if I'll survive, which is why I write to the internet in the hopes that, if he does find me, at least the world will know I am not crazy. That my story can be a cautionary tale. Not everyone is as they seem. They can ruin your life in an instant. You can run into Victor at any time, and I cannot let another soul be cursed with being tortured by him too. So please, be careful who you meet online, especially Tinder. This story happened a while ago, but it still messes with my mind. On a side note, I live in a quiet countryside where is usually nothing happening. I'm an 18-year-old girl who can easily walk around my hometown alone without even being scared because it's really safe here. Basically no crimes. Me and my dog went for a walk one evening. It was nice weather outside, so I decided to go for a nearby field. I usually let my dog out of her leash there, so it was fun for both of us. She's a nice dog and always comes when I call for her. We get to the field, and everything is going really, really well, and nothing seems off, except I have this kind of odd feeling in my gut that I never usually have. The last time I had the same feeling when I was 8 years old, and we were driving at night with my family. I had the same feeling then, and I told it to my parents. I feel like something is wrong. You should be careful. I said something like that. They slowed down because I was oddly serious at the moment. A minute after I said it, a deer came out of nowhere, and we would have crushed if we had gone by the same speed as a minute before. We were all shocked, and my mom thanked me. I still remember it like it was yesterday. However, in the field, 10 years later, I get the same gut feeling. Whatever, I think, and keep going, completely ignoring it. We roll around the fields in a nearby forest until the sunset starts to set. I put my dog back to her leash and decide to leave from one of the tiny paths that go through a small forest. It's the quickest way to my home. It's not a popular way to go, but it's quick. As I'm walking along that path, I suddenly spot a silhouette in the end of the road just before the forest starts. I think nothing of it at that point, and just keep walking, but after just a little while, I have a strong gut feeling and stare at the silhouette for a while. It's then that I notice that the silhouette is staring at me without moving. I just think that maybe they were waiting for someone, because at first the silhouette looked like a child's. But as I got closer, I noticed that it wasn't a child, but a grown man who was riding difficulty-looking child's bicycle. It was a blue-green boy's bicycle. His legs were way too long for it, and his whole body looked like he was forcing himself to ride it. It was really unsettling sight. Still, my dumbass didn't want to turn around and have a couple of kilometers waste of time, and even though it was creepy looking, I still thought, maybe he's waiting for someone that comes from my way. But every step I take, he follows me with intense expression. I'm only like 20 meters away from him when he starts to do a weird jumps on his bike, smiling the ugliest and the most unsettling smile I've ever seen, just staring at me with wide eyes. He kind of looks like he was expecting something and is so excited about it that he needs to jump. He looks like he's in his 50s or something, very long and thin legs and arms, bald, and that creepy, unsettling smile. That's when my alarm rings went on. I glanced behind me and no one was there. It was just me, an 18-years-old small girl with her fluffy dog. Definitely not a guard dog. I turn around and start to jog where I came from, just in case. I glanced at him and sighed in relief when I noticed he wasn't following me or anything. I thought that maybe he wasn't waiting for me after all, and called myself stupid and a scaredy cat. I was so wrong. My adrenaline starts to slow down again as I'm in the middle of the fields, and I still see no sign of him following me. I let my dog out of her leash again, and she starts to run around. I'm nearly at the end of the field. I only have a kilometer or some of forest part before I get to my home after the field part. When my dog spots a rabbit or deer or some interesting thing and flies towards it, I panic because she has never done that before and yell for her. I yell plenty of times for her loudly, and finally she comes back. I'm relieved that nothing happened to her, but as I put her back to her leash, I notice something form the corner of my eye. The freaking bald long legs is biking towards me. He's not looking at the ground when he bikes, but me. Freak out wasn't enough to express my feeling in that moment. I have never seen a human who looks so crazy. More than crazy. What surprised me the most was that he was biking through a field, and I can tell you it is not an easy field to even walk sometimes. It has muddy ponds that you need to jump over, but that psycho just biked through them. He was struggling a lot to bike there, but somehow managed to still do that. I didn't watch for another second behind me because I just started running. I should mention that I have asthma, but did not care. I ran so freaking full speed that I saw black and nearly collapsed. My lungs hurt so bad that I thought I was dying, but the adrenaline kept my blood running and my legs too. Once I glanced behind me and he was there, struggling badly to keep up his full speed on the field grounds with that ugly white smile and the way too little bike. After that, I just ran like crazy until I found a house, hid in their yard without even minding that I was in someone else's yard. It didn't matter to me in that moment at all. I waited a while with my breathing stuck in my throat, but he didn't come. I was planning to yell as loudly as I could if he found me, but he never did. At some point, the adrenaline started leaving my system, and I left my hiding spot. I ran again until I reached an area which had multiple people in their yards, so I would have help if I saw him again. But I didn't. I typed 911 into my phone, but couldn't bring myself to call, mostly because I had no proof, and I didn't want my parents to find out because they are overprotecting, so I wouldn't probably leave my house anymore. I've been paranoid after this incident. My dog was frightened too. I guess she noticed something was really off too. I swear to God that I will always listen to my gut when it's telling me something from now on. I'm still scared of him. I've expected to randomly spot him in some area and what he could have done to me. I can't forget his awful smile. I feel like he's going to jump on my window one night and do what he wants to me. I feel paranoid and helpless. I'm still thinking about calling the police. I grew up in a small, reserved community in Lake George, New York. I lived with 3 siblings and my parents. Me being from New York State, I never visited the city much. I went maybe twice as a kid, but never remembered much of my visits. When I graduated high school, me and my best friend, whom I'm now living with, thought it would be fun to take a small road trip down to NYC. It was just the 2 of us. We stayed for a weekend and had an amazing time. It seemed more magical going to the city this time around than it did years ago. I absolutely fell in love with the city life and wanted more than anything to live there. I work real estate. It's not something I wanted to do or ever thought I would do for a career, but me being 18 and money hungry, thought that I should just go for it and take the 77-hour classes. I ended up getting my real estate license at 19, and I make great money off of doing it. After saving up, I decided to move to NYC. It was the best decision I could have possibly made. I was pursuing my real estate career down there and was renting out and selling properties like crazy. I lived alone while my family and best friend were still in upstate. It didn't take long before I adapted to living alone. I've always been independent. One day, I got home around 6 p.m. and was thinking about making myself dinner because I had went grocery shopping the day before. When I went to get all my groceries out to cook, I noticed some things were missing. I didn't think much of it as I blamed myself for probably forgetting something or using it already without realizing. I shrugged it off and made a dinner with the things I had, as I didn't feel like going back to the store that night. While I was winding down for bed, I heard noises coming from inside the walls. I'm not sure what prompted me to think this, but I just thought that maybe it was mice or rats. I'm not a very skeptical person, so I forgot about it and said I'd take care of it the next day. Over the next couple days, things started getting weirder. Plastic water bottles from the case would randomly disappear. I noticed that my hygiene products were getting low quickly, and food was still going missing. I started to get worried after this. I wanted to set up cameras in my apartment to maybe catch what the problem was, but part of me didn't want to know. I couldn't sleep the next couple nights. I kept hearing those god-awful scratching noises coming from inside the walls, and banging started occurring on the floor. I even swore up and down that I woke up to doors opening and closing one night. The sounds occurred at nighttime, not so much in the morning, me being gone working during the day. I had no idea what could have gone on. However, on this particular morning, it was an early morning for me, about 5 a.m., and it was still dark outside. I heard the noises again. I then grabbed my phone and put 911 in the keypad just in case, but didn't dial it. I started looking in all rooms of my apartment. While looking, I heard a huge bang and didn't hesitate to call the police. When they arrived, I told them what happened and they began searching. One of the officers called the other one into my guest room. There was what looked like to be a crawl space in the back of the closet. One of the officers moved the board that was covering the entrance to the space and shined his flashlight inside. To my shock and horror, the officer pulled out a scrawny, middle-aged white man out of the little room. He looked absolutely cracked out. I had no idea how he could have gotten there. The officer who found him put him in cuffs while the other officer searched the room. He found drug paraphernalia, food wrappers, and weapons such as a semi-automatic pistol and several different pocket knives, as well as knives from my kitchen, not to mention a ton of my personal belongings. The officer said from their observation, it looked like the man had been living in that space for almost a whole week. If I didn't call the police that morning, I might have wound up dead. And from that day on, I moved and promised myself I would never live alone again, or with an unwanted guest at least. My mother was in an abusive relationship for 10 years, but that's not the story here. The story involves what happened after she left that relationship, and there is a lot. It takes someone 7 times on average to leave an abusive relationship, and the most dangerous time to be in an abusive relationship is when the person tries to leave or has left. I know this from first-hand experience. James was not a nice man. He mentally and sometimes physically abused my mother for 10 years. He used mental and verbal abuse on me. I was only a child. My younger sister, who was 5 when we left, was safe from abuse for the time being. When we left, I remember being relieved. Going home to a place where you're insulted and walking on eggshells is never fun. When my mom finally decided to leave, she had a lot to do. Of course, James would make it hard. The day we left, we ran. My mom woke me up, woke my sister up, and threw us in the car. We fled the house because it was too much for her to handle. We ended up in a nice one-bedroom apartment in a small town about an hour away from where we were. James had no idea where we went. My mom wanted to keep it that way. Unfortunately, James still had visitation rights with my sister, and I went along because my sister was too afraid to be with him alone. The first time he came to pick us up, he drove right to the apartment we would be moving into. We had been staying with my grandparents for the week until our apartment was ready. "Is this your new place?" he asked urgently. I remember being silent, and even my sister didn't speak up. James demanded to know again, saying he already knew it was. He then drove away. Later on, when we went home, my mom was freaking out. The landlord kicked us out of the apartment before we could even move in because he had gotten a threatening phone call. It was James, he admitted to calling out of concerns for our safety. He said he wanted to lend us money, make sure we were okay. We ended up almost homeless and moving in with a cousin for 4 months. During these 4 months, James only got worse. He eventually had it so that even I wouldn't go over there. He was demanding to know too much about my mother. When we finally got a place of our own, thanks to subsidy, it was wonderful. I had my own room again, and I lived near some friends. But James was still lurking around. My mom had met someone new, a nice man named Mike with 2 kids near my age. I got along with them, and all seemed well, until we started getting the phone calls. The phone calls were from blocked numbers. The person on the other end would sit in silence, not talking, just breathing. When this started, James started threatening my mother. He would threaten to shoot her. He said he had a gun under his seat and that he would blow her head off. He started calling and telling her details of her day or where she had been at night. Unfortunately, it was hard for us to get a restraining order. It took a long time. Even then, he still for some reason had visitation rights with my sister, so he would come get her even though technically he couldn't be near my mother, and there was nothing we could do despite my mother trying. She didn't want my sister with him. One of the last times we saw him, he came over when my mom was out shopping for groceries. He wasn't supposed to show. He had canceled for that weekend with picking my sister up. But he showed up anyway. It was like he knew where my mother was and when she would be leaving. He came storming up the sidewalk of the apartment complex and scooped my sister up. I ran after them screaming, begging him to please wait until my mom came home. But he threw her in the car seat in the back of his truck and then turned to me from the sidewalk after he picked up her bag. "You know what, Becky? You're going to get what you deserve just like your mother," he said, in this really cold voice with a smirk that was evil. He then used his hand to make a gun motion and said, "Pow," to me, pointing his hand at me as if shooting me. Then he turned away and walked back to his truck, driving away with my sister in tow, screaming for help. I was only 13, so I had no idea what to do. When my mother got back, she panicked. It turns out that James got into a car accident with my sister. She was fine, so was he. It was the last weekend he would get her. But he wasn't done. He had one more trick. Our car at the time was being filled with sand in the gas tank. We figured it was him, but it seemed harmless, and my mom would report it only to find there wasn't much she could do. Well, James wanted one more night with my sister, but my mother decided she would be the one to make the drop-off because she didn't want James near our house. We drove an hour into his town and met at a local store where suddenly James insisted he had to go into the store to use the payphone before cell phones were mainstream, and of course he took a while. He came back out, said a very friendly goodbye, and left. Mom and I were happy he hadn't harassed us or something and started to drive back home. We didn't make it 10 minutes before a cop pulled us over. They made us both get out of the car and patted my mom down. When they saw me, 13 and in tears, they decided I didn't need to be patted down. Then they went and searched the car. What they pulled out from under the driver's seat surprised us both. It was a large bag of heroin, like bigger than a newborn baby. My mom at this point was in shock. She just silently stared at this huge bag of drugs with a look of awe and anger. She looked right at the cop and said, "It was James Wright. He called it in. The cop let my mom drive me to a friend's house in the area. They owned a local small store that didn't receive a lot of business. I remember watching my mom get handcuffed and taken away. I sat there outside the store for hours, refusing to go inside. I just sat and waited for my mom to come back. She did. They figured out it was pinned on her and that the drugs weren't hers. It was James. He got slight trouble for it, but still almost nothing. It was taken off my mother's records. That was it. James went away after that for a while. When he did come back, he was apologetic of his actions, but I could hardly forgive him. He since then has floated in and out of our lives, never once causing harm again. My sister, who is now 14, has told him to never contact her again. I myself can't be around bearded men without freaking out, which is ironic because I am seeing a bearded man right now. I was out partying this Friday night with 4 of my female friends, 2 of which I have just met that evening. We were having drinks at a club in Central Europe. The night was going great. We were dancing and talking. All of us had fun. At around 2 a.m., the girls grabbed a taxi and went home. I've stayed a bit more in the club to finish my drink. I've danced on the stage for about 20 minutes, then I've grabbed a taxi and went home. When I arrived on the street where I live, my drank ass realized that I have no keys and I couldn't get home as I live alone. So I called another taxi and went back to the club to look for my keys. I went to the bar to ask if anybody has brought any lost keys to them that night. Unfortunately, they didn't have my keys, so I started to look for them in the club and every place that I was in that night. I have turned on the flashlight on my phone and have been looking for the keys in a mass of people. About 10 minutes go by, and I haven't found anything apart from broken glass and cigarette butts. I went back to the place where I was initially looking for them. This is the place where we have been having our drinks with the girls. I have started to look for my keys on the sitting benches instead of on the ground. I've had my keys in the inside pocket of my jacket, as I always do, and my jacket was placed in the corner of that bench the whole night before I first left. People were sitting on the benches, and they've had their jackets on the benches too. I sat down near the corner where I was sitting before, and besides me was a guy with lines of some drugs on his phone, freely giving them to other people. He had put his jacket in the corner of the bench, and I wanted to look at the corner of the bench to see if my keys haven't been pushed into the corner or something, so I grabbed his jacket, and to my surprise, my keys were right under his jacket in the middle of the bench. I was so happy to find my keys. I was drunk and started pretty much yelling how happy I am to find my keys, as I was getting fucking desperate at that moment. There was a guy on that bench that we have met with the girls before in the club. I will call him L. He was really nice during the whole night, and so I kept talking to L when I found my keys. I've even went to the bar and grabbed another beer just to talk for a bit more with L. I went to the toilet to have a pee, and when I came back, L had found himself an acquaintance to which he was talking. So I just started to finish my beer while I smoked a cigarette and was getting ready to go home. This is when the guy that had lines of some drugs on his phone has started talking to me. I will call him Pedro, as it was definitely a fake name that he gave me. I've been talking with him in English. Pedro was 19 years old and he was from Colombia. He told me stories about how life is in Colombia and how his family struggles. He told me that his father has died recently, and he is the oldest son, so he is in Slovakia trying to make some money for the family. He even showed me photos of him and his family back in Colombia. I sympathized with Pedro, and I was feeling sorry for him. After about 20 minutes, El has scored with a girl that he met, and he said that they're going home. He asked Pedro if he has any MDMA on him, and he sold some to them, so El left with the girl. People around on the bench have seen that happening, and so they wanted some drugs from Pedro, so he started to make lines on his phone again. I told Pedro that I'm going home and wished him best luck, grabbed my jacket and started walking. This is when Pedro called out to me and stopped me, said that it's late and he should go back to the hotel too. He scratched the drugs from his phone onto the table, took his belongings and told the people that they can finish whatever was left for free. Me and Pedro have walked out of the underground club. When we were outside, he asked me if I could walk him to his hotel, which was nearby, a 5-minute walk. He told me in the club that he has no friends and no family in Slovakia. I really sympathized with him. I told him that sure, I can walk him to the hotel. We were talking the whole walk, and he was saying really nice things to me, like how I get his situation and how a good person I am. When we arrived at the hotel, the door was closed, and he messaged to someone to come and open the door for him. He asked if I want to have one last beer with him, to which I said sure, but I will be on my way once we finish the beer. Some girl came and opened the door for us. They have spoken in Spanish as they greeted. The hotel itself didn't really look like a public hotel. There was a reception and stairs up, and on the left was a dining room. Pedro told me to wait for him in the dining room. This was like 5 a.m. already. I went to the dining room, and there was a girl sitting with her laptop. I greeted her with hola and sat down. Pedro came after maybe 3 to 5 minutes with 2 opened cans of some beverage. There was a parrot and a Jack Daniels logo. The can was in gold color, I think. This is the moment that I should get suspicious and not drink from an opened can. My naive and drunk ass overlooked this fact, and I have drank from the can. I was talking with Pedro about all the drug cartels in Colombia and how is their politics fucked up. After about 10 minutes, I started to feel weird, and I looked at my phone. My hands and eyes were tingling. I was quickly aware of what was happening now. I turned on the location and mobile data on my phone, and I put the phone in a different pocket than I did that night. Pedro started to ask me how I'm feeling, to which my adrenaline levels blown up. I started to think that I'm being abducted by some Colombian human trafficking ring. My sight started to weirdly tingle, and the lights were blinding me. My jaw was fucked up as I was pushing my teeth together. I have taken drugs in the past, and this felt like a stimulant and a dissociative, which was really weird for me to understand. I tried to keep my voice calm and my mind present. I told Pedro that I know what is going on, and I asked him why he gave me a stimulant if he needs me unconscious. Pedro's hand started to shake, and he didn't answer to me. The girl at the laptop has looked right in my eyes, the first time that she even moved with her body. Pedro grabbed his phone and started to write to somebody on WhatsApp. I told Pedro that they did a mistake in the dose and that I'm fine apart from having been unknowingly drugged. I think that Pedro had drugged me back in the club while I went to the toilet, which was why he quickly got up when I was leaving. Everything I said, Pedro rewrote to somebody else, and he always waited for an incoming message before saying anything to me. I started to talk to the girl too, told her that I don't give a fuck about what are they doing there, but I'm walking out. At one moment, I remember saying that I get what Pedro is doing, but I don't get what the girl's part was in all of this, to which I was pointing my finger at her. Pedro has got a notification on his phone, and he told to me that he is sorry and I can go home if I want. I didn't respond to him, got my drugged ass up, and as I was walking out of the dining room, I stopped by the girl with her laptop, stared right into her eyes, and I held my right hand up in a fist bump. She looked in my eyes, gave me a fist bump, and did a weird grimace on her face. I walked to the door at the reception, which were closed. I started to kick and punch the doors while yelling, "Open the fucking door!" The receptionist did, and I walked out. My heart was pumping. My whole body was shaking. I was feeling both dizzy and awake. I ran to a main street, and I was calling my mom to come and get me as fast as possible, but I didn't know where I was. I was feeling dissociated and couldn't really apprehend to what just happened. As I got to a main street where a bus stop was, I started to feel very paranoid. There was a white Mercedes SUV that stopped right in the main road near the bus stop that I stood on. They turned off the car lights and were just standing there. I told all of this to my mom, and she told me to look for a camera, so I stood right under a camera which was at the bus stop to make sure that I'm seen. I was feeling and talking weirdly, to which my mom told me to talk to her, to tell her what I can see around me. I have seen a few people that walked to the main street. Everybody was on their phone and occasionally looking at me. One guy came close to the bus stop, and I approached him while I still had my mom on the phone. I asked him what does he want from me, and he was like, "I'm sorry, do I know you?" To which I said that I'm sorry. After about 10 minutes of me being on the phone with my mom, the white SUV turned on the engine and left off. My mom came by car soon after. I was walking to her car on the road, but I couldn't walk properly. I felt paranoid, tons of adrenaline going through my body. My heart was pumping so fast, I thought I'm going to have some kind of a seizure. I managed to get in my mom's car. She was in her pajamas, so much scared. I started to tell her everything that happened. I told her to drive around our city instead of driving me home in case they are following us. We were driving around for maybe an hour, talked about what happened during the night, how the inside of that building looked and all. My jaw was going so crazy that my mom could hear it, and she was really scared for me. The whole ride, I was feeling really weird. At one point, I felt like my soul left my body. I can't really describe it. I didn't feel like myself, like I'm not real. Lights were blinding me, and my vision was blurred and tingling, like my eyes were going up and down all the time. I didn't feel no rushes of euphoria or anything. I thought that they gave me some mix of drugs. I arrived at my home at around 7:30 a.m. My mom stayed at home with me, comforting me. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. We were talking about going to the police, and also about if I'm in any kind of danger anymore. At around 11 a.m., I fell asleep. During this time, my mom cleaned my apartment and my sister came to visit me. I don't know what I would do without my family. One of my girlfriends that was with me during that night came to visit me. As I talked to her, I thought that I got some kind of an episode, like schizophrenic or something. Like, why the hell would I be a target of something like this? I'm a chubby, beardy guy. Why would they want to abduct me? I'm afraid of going to the police, as our police department and politics are corrupt, and they always worked with any kind of mafias as long as I can remember. They would take my testimony, start to investigate, and then they would be stopped by their officials. I still don't fully believe that what happened to me was an experience with human trafficking ring. However, there are so many red flags of it in what I can remember. Why would be Pedro scared after I called them out? Why would he stop talking to me unless someone sent him a message on his phone? Why the fuck would he even drug me without me knowing it? And why the fuck would they let me go? A little update. I went to the ER with my mom this early morning as I woke up with spasms all over my body. They gave me an IV and sent a sample of my blood for toxicology report. They ran some tests and sent me home. The results of the toxicology just came by mail. There were traces of acetylfentanyl, methylphenidate, and ketamine in my blood. Working in a call center, I have had the privilege of meeting and talking to some incredible people and have heard so many interesting stories which I will likely never forget. One story I will remember for a long time comes from the time I spoke to a man who ran a media and television production company, and he told me a little anecdote about his experience meeting Michael Jackson. This isn't relevant to the story I'm about to tell, but I'll tell it anyway. So this man, I'll just refer to him as Customer, was editing his latest television documentary, and Michael Jackson had been fascinated with the process. He told me that he had been working on this edit for about 4 or 5 hours, in complete silence with Michael Jackson, just sitting and watching without saying a word the entire time. When he finally does speak, Michael quietly asks if it would be okay if he brought some friends in. Slightly surprised and startled by this, Customer says, "Sure," and Michael pops out for a couple of minutes before returning with a number of homeless people. Customer said that they were all a different race and that it reminded him of the village people or something. They then all sat quietly and politely while Customer continued to work on his edit. I just loved that I spoke to a man who had spent time with Michael Jackson and had shared a story that just seemed so on brand, and I wonder how many other people know that story. It's customer experiences like this that make the work so enjoyable, and no 2 days are different. That being said, I have also had encounters with some truly terrifying encounters as well. It's estimated that 1 out of every 100 people fits the clinical criteria for psychopathy, So you can imagine how, working as a call center agent, speaking to hundreds of customers a week, you're bound to encounter some psychopathic people, and this is what this story is about. As I've said earlier, the names in this story have been altered for privacy reasons, and I will be a bit vague about the location and company. However, it wouldn't take much for anyone to figure this out. At the time of this incident, I was working for a large Spanish bank in Bradford city centre in Yorkshire, England. It's a normal Tuesday afternoon in the office when I hear one of my colleagues, Lundy, starting to talk loudly and becoming more assertive. But there were a few cracks in his voice which told me and everyone else nearby that he was speaking with a difficult customer. This is nothing out of the ordinary, as I'm sure you can imagine. People tend to treat call center agents like machines, and sometimes forget that there's a human being on the end of the line who wants to help but has a job to do. Well, this conversation starts to get a bit heated. I hear Lundy saying things like, "I'm sorry, but you have already had 2 goodwill gesture refunds, and we should only have given 1. We can't just waive your interest charges. They're a condition of not paying your balance in full. I can't put you through to a manger now, but I can request a callback for you." It then starts to escalate to the point where Lundy is saying, "No, I will not waive your charges. If you want to log a complaint, that's fine. Like I said, my name is Lundy. I don't have to give you my last name. If you continue using language like that, I will terminate this call." At this point, most people have gone quiet and are all looking over at Lundy, who looks like he's about to slam his headset on the desk. Finally, Lundy says, "Good luck with that. You don't know what I look like," before ending the call. He exhaled sharply, took his headset off, and stood up. There was a collective, "What was that about?" coming from everyone in the office. Lundy, who is a really polite and mild-mannered guy, getting this worked up was weird, but he told us that he had been speaking with a customer who wanted us to waive his interest charges on his credit card. We had previously waived 2 months' worth of interest as a goodwill gesture, even though we didn't need to, and he wanted us to do it again. I guess he just expected that he could have a free credit card if he called in every month and asked for the charges to be waived. This month, though, he owed a few £100 and was not happy when we refused to waive these charges. He was using vile, racist language, had threatened to get Lundy fired, and even ended the call by saying, "I'm going to come to your office, and you better pray I don't get my hands on you." Now, we have multiple offices around the UK, and each department is located in one of these offices, so when a customer calls, the only indication they might have as to which office they've gotten through to would be the regional accent. For example, if you call the general banking team, you're likely to hear a Liverpudlian accent. If you call the fraud team, you'll likely hear a Midlands accent, and if you call credit cards and mortgages, you'll hear a Yorkshire accent. So the customer's warning didn't really concern anyone too much, and as Lundy said, all the customer had to go on was a name and a voice. He had no idea which office Lundy was based in, or even what he looked like. Looking at the customer's registered address, he lived a couple hours' drive away anyway, and no customer would be that angry over a self-inflicted interest charge that they would track down a call center agent, would they? Well, I wouldn't be telling this story if it ended there. So a few days have passed by this point, and everything has continued as normal. We have all just about forgotten about Lundy's call with that customer. It's Friday, it's summertime. We're all looking forward to 5 p.m. and starting the weekend, knowing that we still have over 4 hours of daylight left. As we all log off and start making our way out the building, I notice a bouquet of flowers on the desk at reception, but I don't think anything of it. The receptionist then calls to Lundy as he's making his way to the exit and tells him that these flowers are addressed to him. Confused, Lundy takes the flowers and looks at the label, and sure enough, they were addressed to him. The receptionist then says to him, "Someone must love you." Kind of ironic now that I think about it. We are all going our separate ways when not a minute later I hear a commotion. I look to see what it is, and in the car park, Lundy is on the ground with a man on top of him, beating him senseless. He was quickly pulled off of Lundy and restrained by officer security before the police were called. It didn't take long for us to learn who this guy was and why he had done what he did. As I'm sure you figured out, It was the man that Lundy had spoken to a few days earlier. He had worked out which office Lundy worked at and had flowers sent to him. Although he didn't know what Lundy looked like, all he needed was to see who walked out with the flowers, and he was able to put the pieces together. Luckily, Lundy's injuries weren't too bad, but he did have a few days off work. This just goes to show that when you work a call center job, you never really know who you're speaking to. This happened about 6 years ago. As stated, I was about 12 and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the U.S. Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Also of note was that he is a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, and by then was an active-duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to fuck around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night we were camping out. Around 8 p.m. we had our camp set up, eaten dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy shit, guns, girls, etc. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys who looked to be in their late 20s wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys, I got a seriously creepy vibe from them dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kind of hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we had been out there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake, had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to shit my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours, around 2 a.m. I'd managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had his pistol and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. the group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or so minutes, had reached it. There were 5 of them, and like 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers or campers, nobody who comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns and has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared shitless. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail, and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by this. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me land navigation pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light, so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point, I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a while longer when out of nowhere they started screaming, "Where you all at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then started walking back the direction they had come. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our shit, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that because I thought they might never let me go camp again. Creepy rednecks in the woods. Let's not meet again. You might get shot next time. An update. We never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff going on. However, it is truly a wilderness area, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly, otherwise, who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our camp, the game warden showed up pretty soon afterwards, but I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on and took another trail to try and cut them off. We waited around 30 minutes for him to come back, and he said there were other officers out looking. There are only so many paths that you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would also have to be done on foot. So this happened in 2015, to be exact. I've come to terms with what happened. It all starts when myself and a group of friends were coming back on the train, having seen our favorite soccer team lose pretty bad. We were, as you can imagine, a bit disheartened. However, we were determined to have a laugh and joke on the way back. So we got on the train, and as soon as I stepped foot in the doorway, I instantly felt something was wrong. I'm no Spider-Man, but everyone has felt the feeling when you know something is just wrong. We sat down, much to my protest, in the middle seats of the train. I scouted around but couldn't see anything unusual, so I just put it down to my mind playing tricks. Keep in mind, this is a train journey from one side of England to the other, so we was going to be on for quite some time. I don't know how long it was until I noticed the man, but I'd say it was around 30 minutes. When we got on the train, I can quite clearly remember him sat in the left corner as you walk through the door, so naturally none of us saw him till we sat down, even though we just walked by him. What I noticed is that he had moved multiple seats in front of his original position. The train section we was in was empty, really just a handful of people. I wondered what he was doing, but just let it go. About 5 minutes later, I saw him move again. This time I ignored my friends and locked my entire concentration on him. What I saw really annoyed me for some reason. His eyes were completely locked on a cute girl. I remembered having a brief conversation with her as I went to get some coffee for the journey back. She was the same age as me and my friends and lived a couple of towns away. She had also gone to watch the same football team, but had fallen out with her friend, so they decided to stay away from each other for the ride home. I thought this wasn't a very smart idea, but I didn't want to push my opinions on her. I continued to watch him and noticed him writing something down on some crappy notebook he had, which looked like he'd pulled it out of the ground. He was about 3 seats behind her when he stood up and sat in the seat facing her. She was reading a book and had earphones in, so she didn't notice him till a few moments later. She looked up in shock, and he began to talk to her. I instantly knew she was very uncomfortable with this guy near her. By this time, my friends had noticed what I was doing and also felt that something was off. I turned to my best friend and said, "We've got to do something." He wasn't sure how we should go about this. I looked over again, and now he was sat on the same side to her, leaning up against her. I had enough and stood up and walked over to them. I sat where the man had previously been and saw the girl's face light up. I began to talk to her and ask her questions when the man stopped me mid-sentence and asked me to leave them alone. I stood up. By the way, I'm not very intimidating. I'm around 6'1" and average size build, and said to my new friend, "Do you want to come with me and meet some of my friends?" She accepted without hesitancy. I told the man to move and led her by, which he obliged. She sat with us for the remainder of the trip. I noticed the man was staring at me the entire trip with a look of pure anger and hatred. I shook it off and watched as the man walked out of the exit as we pulled up at a close stop to ours. It was now our turn to exit the train, and the girl thanked me, and we exchanged numbers. I thought this was now all over, and I was very happy with myself. However, it was far from. Neither of our group could legally drive a car, so we aimed to get on the bus, which would take us home. The feeling I had when I got on the train was still with me, so I was always alert. It was now around 11 p.m. now, and it was really dark out. We stood a good 10 minutes at the bus stop before I noticed someone was watching us from behind a van. I acted as if I had never seen the person and just looked every few seconds. I began to make out the silhouette of a tall figure with no hair. It felt like I was looking right at Slender Man. I knew this wasn't the case, but it made me really unnerved. I then pointed the person out to my friends very slyly. They agreed that there was someone watching us. We thought of a plan. We would jump him, her, and ask them what they was doing. We began to talk increasingly louder, making up some *T about us needing to go to the shop. We crossed the road to the van, and the person didn't move. This really unsettled me. Was I just overreacting? As we turned to walk around the back of the van, the prick from earlier jumped out the back of the van holding a butcher's knife. A fucking butcher's knife! We all just legged it into people's gardens, hurtling over any fence in our way. It's safe to say, after the 5th fence, we had lost the psycho. We sat trying to catch our breath and go over WTF just happened. About 20 minutes later, we got up and walked back onto the road. The 2 people had gone and the van with them. We got on the bus and left the area. It wasn't long before I noticed the van was back. I tried to alert my friends without them freaking out, but it was no use. My best friend immediately contacted the police while I informed the bus driver. He carried on driving as my friend was reeling off what the operator was telling him. The police soon came and escorted us home. However, the van had long gone once the sirens could be heard. We eventually all got home safe. Hopefully the van didn't see where we all lived, but the police reassured us they would investigate. I haven't heard anything since and don't expect to. I've since kept contact with the girl and we are really good friends now. She says everything was sorted out between her and her friend if anyone was wondering. I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it. I took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck with easy-to-find spots that I could set up in that overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all, no rabbit or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night but lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m. and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, it was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something, twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost!" There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help! Please, I can't walk!" the voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person. So good I mistook him for a bear. That's a fucking trap. This guy is trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. "Fuck off!" I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will fuck you up. Go away!" He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck, breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab, but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone, never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen the bastard, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole on these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw definitely was a wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, it was freaky as hell. If you like this story and want to see more, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video.